Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Feel free to get settled in. We're going to get started in a few minutes at 11:05 once folks are in. So just feel free to get comfy. We're thrilled to have you here. All right, for folks who are joining now, you'll see on your screen we have some check-in questions. We'd love to hear from you in the chat, your name, location, organization, and pronouns. And then we have a couple of questions for you as well. We're going to get started at 11:05, so feel free to put that in the chat while we wait. I'm also going to post a link to the slides. Everyone should have received those this morning, but just in case, those are there for your reference. Welcome to everyone joining. We're excited to have you. For folks just hopping on, we're going to start full speed at 11:05, but in the meantime, we would love to hear your check-in answers in the chat. So when you can, please share your name, location, organization, pronouns. And then we're also asking some questions about what you hope to learn today and what you hope to contribute to the conversation today. Good morning, everyone. Hi, Julia. Hi, Suzanne. Great to have you all with us. I'm going to get started in 2 more minutes. For those just joining, we've got a couple check-in questions for the chat. Welcome, everybody. Once more, for those just joining, we're going to get started in 1 minute. And in the meantime, we've got some check-in questions for the chat. Welcome and thanks for joining us. All right, it is 11:05, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome again. It is great to see you all here. We're really excited for this conversation and for our awesome speakers who have agreed to join us today. My name is Amanda Dewey. I am a senior research analyst at Equitiy on our local policy team. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Ariel Drehobel. She's a local policy manager. And we also have Kate Tanabe, who's going to be helping with Zoom logistics from the local policy team at Equitiy as well. If we can go quickly to the next slide. I want to kick us off with a few housekeeping items, starting with some workshop expectations. Just a couple reminders and requests that we have for you all today. First, we ask that you mute your mic when you're not speaking and that you use Zoom tools as much as possible, reactions, hand raising, etc., just to help things keep moving smoothly. We also ask that you be polite, concise, and have a sense of humor in the chat, and that you bring understanding, patience, and empathy to our conversations today. We hope that you'll give space for yourself and others to express complete thoughts. And we all know that the energy and energy efficiency spaces has no shortage of jargon, industry words, and acronyms. So we hope that you will clarify those when using them so that everybody can follow and participate in the conversation. And then finally, I'll ask that to make room for all to speak, that you consider what we call the step up, step back framework. If you've already spoken several times at any point in the conversation, maybe you step back a little bit so you can let others have a chance to have some room and space. On the other hand, if you haven't engaged as much, consider stepping up so others can benefit from your questions, experience, and ideas. If anyone has questions or comments about these expectations or want to suggest additional ones, feel free to put those in the chat while we quickly go over our objectives, and we can go to the next slide, please. So just to remind us about our 4 main objectives that we have today, I won't read these verbatim, but essentially we've got 4 goals today. And the first is to get a foundational understanding of energy equity. The second is understanding how equity metrics are currently being used to track progress on equity. We're going to learn from utility speakers on how they're using equity metrics in their own work. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, we're going to identify paths forward for you and your organization for prioritizing and measuring equity in your own work. Those are our 4 objectives for today. Any questions or comments about that? Feel free to throw them in the chat. Next slide, please. Perfect. And just an overview of our agenda as well. You'll see we have this here. Times are Eastern. I know not everyone's in that time zone, so just a flag. We're going to start after I finish with this housekeeping. Today, we're going to start with some grounding equity basics information before moving on to our 3 awesome speakers. We're going to have time for question and answer after each, and we'll have 2 10-minute breaks today. We're going to spend the final hour on a breakout activity that's designed to help you develop a work plan and a path forward. One thing I do want to note about our agenda is that we have a bit of a different schedule. You might have seen on the conference webpage a mention of a 30-minute lunch break. We found that folks prefer more smaller breaks, shorter breaks. So you'll see we have 2 10-minute breaks here. With that said, feel free to walk away if you need to. Snack, drink, anything you might need throughout the course of our time together today. All right, next slide, please. The last bit of grounding that I want to do before we get started is to go over some of our survey results. And I want to thank everyone who took the time to complete our pre-workshop survey, just to help us get a sense of who is in the room, priorities folks are bringing to the table, experience. And so I want to briefly share some takeaways with you. You'll see that we got 21 responses, which we appreciated very much. And the first question we asked about was about familiarity with equity concepts. You'll see here on this first little pie chart and results section that most folks labeled themselves as somewhat familiar or very familiar with basic equity concepts. So it seems like a lot of folks feel like they're bringing a decent amount of experience and understanding to the table. And then we also asked about the degree to which people are currently using equity metrics in their work. Most folks said that they've used a few. That was the largest group, that they've used a few, but they see some room for growth, some paths forward, some things they're hoping to accomplish to institutionalize that more into their work and organization. Another fairly large group said they haven't started yet. So we're thrilled to have you here because that's why we're here. And then there's a couple who have said, hey, we've got several equity metrics going on, and so we're excited to learn from them. And we know in this space, there's always room to grow and move forward. Next slide, please. And then we had a couple of qualitative questions on our survey as well. The first one asking, what types of equity metrics are folks using for the folks that are already doing this work? Some that stood out in a few different responses were folks measuring energy burden, which I'm sure will come up today, and measurements around program demographics and outreach and engagement. Some others mentioned in their responses that they've taken more of a conceptual approach at their organization to equity issues. So they consider and prioritize equity, but not in a way yet that's using defined metrics to track their progress. And then finally, we also asked about the barriers that folks have experienced in this work in trying to measure and track their progress on equity. And one that really stood out from the responses was a lack of shared definition of equity and environmental justice among stakeholders and collaborators. So if folks mentioned, if policymakers and their organization and other organizations they work with and utilities, if we're using different definitions of what we mean by equity, it can be hard to collaborate and work together and move forward. Other folks mentioned just it not quite being a priority yet. If measuring progress on equity and equity in general aren't identified as priorities, it's hard to put the time and the resources into them. And then finally, there were several responses around data access challenges. It can just be hard to collect and analyze the types of data that might be most useful. So with that gives us sort of our grounding of who's in the room and what folks are bringing to the table today. We're so excited for this conversation. And with this, I'm going to turn it over to Ariel, who's going to give us our grounding equity basics.
Thank you, Amanda, and welcome. It's great to see, wow, so many people in this workshop today. It's too bad we can't all be together in person, but maybe next year, hopefully. All right, so we developed this workshop based on some of the learnings from ACEE's Leading with Equity initiative this year, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. And as Amanda said, we designed this workshop to provide a brief overview up front here on some of the thinking that we've done on equity metrics. I will say up front that, as Amanda said, there are different ways to think about equity in the energy sector and metrics to measure it. And I would say there's not one definition. I'm going to go over a few in a moment. And I think it's important to make sure that expectations of what we mean when we're talking about equity align with the communities that we're looking to serve with the programs and the policies and offerings that we are providing. All right, so I'm going to give a bit of overview up front here, and then we'll spend most of the time today diving more deeply into the case studies that Amanda mentioned. But at this point, I'm going to kick us off with a little bit of grounding. Here we go. All right, so to start, before we dive into any definitions, I think it's important to acknowledge that historic and current policies at the federal, state, and local level have led to low-income and communities of color often living in older and poorer quality housing, which leads to impacts on health, comfort, and energy affordability. These outcomes are due to historic policies of underinvestment and disinvestment that have led to inequitable patterns that we see in housing and energy today. Some examples of these policies include redlining, discriminatory lending, mass incarceration, employment discrimination, and historic underfunding of schools. And I think it's important to understand what has led to the reality that folks live in today. How did we create a society where certain communities experience disproportionately high energy burdens, pollution burdens, and energy injustices? This didn't happen naturally, and it's important to understand that it's a product of policy decisions, because I think knowing this can help us to envision how we can change policies to move towards a just transition towards climate, energy, and environmental justice. So I just wanted to start with that. All right. So this workshop is focused on equity metrics and ways to measure energy equity. So the next few slides I have here provide an overview of different ways to think about equity in the energy sector and how we can categorize metrics to measure equity. I want to start by sharing this great video that was created by Daphne Rose Sanchez with Kinetic Communities Consulting. which provides a visual way to think about equity metrics in the energy sector. And I will narrate over the video. It's just images. So here we go. All right, so let's start by thinking about energy equity as a race in which two teams are competing, a green team and an orange team. Yet these teams are competing in the same race under very different conditions. The green team is running on an open track while the orange team has many hurdles in their path. Naturally, the green team is going to win more often because they aren't facing the same barriers. They receive awards, sponsorships, and benefits from their success, which helps to cement the green team in as a leader for a long time, maybe even leading to folks thinking that the green team is naturally better at the race and deserves to be winning compared to the orange team. Then generations later, the hurdles are removed for the orange team. So now they're able to run the same race as the green team. But even so, the green team has generations of investment and accumulated power that give them a solid advantage over the orange team in the race. They have better equipment, sponsors, and a baked-in head start that the orange team doesn't have. Without acknowledgement of the barriers that were removed and support for the orange team to build the resources, wealth, and power that the green team was able to build, the orange team will remain at a disadvantage moving forward, even as folks say that they no longer are facing those barriers. The green team owes their wins to their history and the privilege their team has accumulated at the expense of the orange team. So when we think about addressing inequities, advantages and disadvantages in the energy sector, we can do so through thinking about them through the dimensions of equity and how we can account for those advantages that one team may have had over the other through that analogy. I hope that was helpful. So, all right, now I'm gonna jump forward, yep. All right, so this slide here includes the framework that ACEEE is currently using to think about energy equity. We adapted this framework from a 2014 Urban Sustainability Directors Network report that identifies 4 dimensions of equity for thinking about clean energy policymakers and program developers for how they can think about how to incorporate more equity into the policies and decisions that they're making. So the first category that we use to think about this is structural equity, which recognizes that decisions are made within historical, cultural, and institutional dynamics and structures that have led to clean energy inequities. Decision makers should reform policies and programs that perpetuate these disparities and work to build policies and program agendas that are fair and just. Thinking back to the example previously, those barriers were literally in place that were preventing one team from being able to access the same things that the other team could access. So thinking about these structures that are placed in society. Second is procedural equity, which says that we should offer inclusive, accessible, authentic engagement and representation in processes of developing or implementing clean energy policies and programs. One example of this is for community members impacted by policy or programs to take an active leadership role in planning processes with their needs and concerns driving the development and outcomes of programs, goals, or solutions that are on the table. And then next is distributional equity, which aims for clean energy policies and programs to achieve a fair distribution of benefits and burdens across all community segments. This means that the negative impacts of the energy sector are not concentrated in frontline and environmental justice communities, and that the benefits of clean energy investments, such as lower bills, clean energy jobs, investment dollars, community wealth building, are distributed across all communities equitably. So again, thinking back to that last example, the green team was able to accumulate a lot of awards and power by winning and doing well over time that the orange team wasn't able to accumulate. So there was a different distribution of who was receiving those benefits. And then lastly, we have transgenerational equity, which states that policies and programs should consider, address, and mitigate intergenerational impacts and think about how our decisions are going to impact future generations. Our children, their children may not be here yet or are here, and it's important to think about how our decisions will lead to impacts on their future. So there are many metrics that can help us measure how well decision makers are moving towards achieving structural, procedural, distributional, and transgenerational equity. I'll give a few examples in a bit. And I Also want to acknowledge that there are other ways to think about energy equity. And partners in the field have some different dimensions of equity frameworks that they are using. And I want to give a few examples of those. One second, there we go. And again, I'll say ACEE's definition and framework is continually adapting and evolving. And we have a lot to learn from our partners. And again, I think that the dimensions and definitions that are being used should align with how communities want us to be thinking about this as well. So this example on this slide is an overview of the dimensions of equity that the Energy Equity Project, led by the University of Michigan's Energy Justice Lab, are currently using to think about energy equity. The Energy Equity Project is working to create a framework for measuring energy equity across a set of indicators for different locations that can provide guidance to a range of users. So I think, policymakers, decision makers, utilities. And they're working now to develop this framework through a stakeholder engagement process. And this pyramid here has their dimensions of equity that they're using. So they also have procedural equity and distributed equity, but they also have dimensions for recognition and restorative equity. So this pyramid shows how they're thinking about these dimensions across an axis of addressing symptoms and root causes of energy inequities, which I think is great. And you can learn more about the project and sign up for updates on their website if you're interested. Another example I want to highlight is from the Initiative for Energy Justice's 100 Justice in 100 report card and scorecard. So this report includes an overview of metrics to measure equity for renewable energy programs across energy access and affordability, procedural justice and democracy, economic participation and community ownership, and health and environmental impacts. They divide these metrics up across 5 dimensions, including process, which is procedural equity, restoration, decision-making, benefits, which is more that distributed piece, and then access. So even though their metrics are focused on renewable energy, many are transferable to energy efficiency and other energy justice priorities. And I think this is a great resource for folks to check out. And then lastly, I want to highlight one more way of thinking about the dimensions of energy equity. This is a framework created by the Urban Institute and the Green and Healthy Homes Initiative in a 2019 report on the state of equity measurement. There's a link to it on the slide here. So they looked at equity across 6 dimensions, including historical legacies, just some of that structural piece, awareness of populations, inclusion of voices, access discrimination, output differences, and disparate impacts. So these categories match with some of the dimensions that we use. So some are a little bit different for thinking about equity, and you can learn more by checking out this report here. As Amanda said as well, that we posted a link to the slides. Maybe she can repost that for folks who joined a little bit later. So if you want to, dig into these resources, look more at these slides, at these definitions, please feel free to do that as well as I move forward. Also, if anybody has any questions, feel free to post those in the chat as well, and we can answer those if we have time now, or I can respond in the chat. All right, so I also want to give a brief overview for folks about ACEE's Leading with Equity initiative, as a lot of the learnings from that initiative have shaped this conversation and the work that ACEEE is currently doing around equity metrics within our organization. So underpinning ACEE's 2030 goals is an organizational commitment to fostering a vibrant and equitable economy that uses energy more efficiently, reduces energy costs, and promotes the health, safety, and well-being of everyone. To move towards this vision, ACEEE launched our Leading with Equity initiative in early 2021 with the goal of centering equity across metrics in ACEE's state, utility, and city scorecards. We use these scorecards to hold decision makers accountable to their clean energy policies and commitments. And we want to make sure that all of those who are leading in our scorecards must be leading on equity in the future. So in order to score in that, that top position, that top 10 position, folks will need to be leading on, metrics that are measuring structural, procedural, distributional equity. So throughout 2021, we convened a group of stakeholders, including utilities, community-based organizations, and advocates, to discuss priorities for centering equity metrics in our scorecards with a focus on the priorities from community-based organizations. We held parallel workshops with one group consisting of utilities and program implementers and another group consisting of advocates and community-based organizations. We had about 20 participants in each group. I think some of them are on the call today, so good to see some of you. And I'll flag, we also provided stipends for community-based participants in our workshops. We held our first workshop in April where we discussed our shared vision for an equity, a more equitable energy future, and where we identified some priority elements for thinking about metrics. Our second workshop in June, we discussed barriers and leverage points to collecting data to measure and hold decision makers accountable across cities, states, and utilities. And then in our last workshop, we discussed priorities for incorporating new metrics in the scorecards. We're right now writing up these findings. We'll be publishing them in December, so you can look for those there. This slide includes a high-level overview of the metric categories that emerged as the highest priority through our workshops to include in ACEEE scorecards across procedural, distributional, and structural equity categories. We plan to collect data on and develop metrics related to these categories in the upcoming city, state, and utility scorecards. These were the priorities that emerged as most important for our community-based partners who were on the calls with us in the workshops. So in the procedural equity category, we are planning to include metrics that look to measure how programs are targeting and reaching marginalized communities, if and how engagement processes embed authentic participation that drives and defines outcomes, if decision makers provide compensation for engagement, and if language access is included in processes to ensure that all folks can participate. For distributional equity, we are planning to include metrics that emerge as priorities, such as looking at energy affordability goals and progress towards those goals, measuring access to existing programs, access to data on disconnections and shutoffs, and measuring the equitable distribution of benefits through accountability structures. And then priority metrics that emerged across structural equity dimensions include ones related to consumer protections, strategies and programs for community wealth building, so how investments can build wealth for communities, policies to ensure data access, and benchmarks and evaluations emerged as top priorities there. So these are all of the themes that we're going to be looking at. And then as we work to collect data for our scorecards, we're going to develop specific metrics to measure how well cities, utilities, and states are doing across these different dimensions here. And then as for next steps, we'll be publishing our summary report of takeaways from the initiative in December, which will include all of the metrics that emerged in our discussions, which I think was maybe about like 30 different metrics, as well as other lessons that we learned through our research. We're also planning for the leads of our 3 scorecards to develop roadmaps as to what new equity metrics they're going to be including next year in order to hold us accountable to these commitments that we made through this process. And moving into next year, we're also planning to work to develop new data requests and metrics, as I said, for the scorecards. And we want to work with cities, states, utilities, and regulators to work to address barriers to equity data collection, goal setting, and accountability. There is so much more that we could go into in terms of talking about how to measure different equity metrics, which ones may be most important. I think, for the conversations we're going to have today, I think it's great to in your mind, think about how you could develop metrics maybe across these 3 different categories for the work that you're doing, thinking about, internal equity within your organization or externally, how, you're having an impact on communities and those that you're serving. I see one question that popped up in the chat. We're going to be incorporating these metrics directly into the scorecards that we currently have. So into our existing city, states, and utility scorecards. So we'll be adapting the metrics there. I see another question for me about procedural equity. So for procedural equity, we are often thinking about how folks are engaging with those who are most impacted by their policies and programs. So And I think it's especially important to think about how stakeholder engagement processes are authentic, are accountable to the folks who are participating. There's also metrics that you could think about in terms of, who is in decision-making positions and who has the power to enact, processes and decisions. So like who is in leadership within organizations, within utilities, who is in, leadership as regulators, who's making these decisions. So we have a variety of different, thoughts on that as well that I can share. And then lastly, before we move on to our next section, please also feel free to post more questions in the chat. I just want to also highlight and center how important it is to ensure that, to achieve these equitable outcomes we're talking about, that we need to make sure that we're centering accountability in the discussion. And that can be done through transparent expectations and commitments that are made to the communities that we're serving. And I want to highlight the Sierra Club's Shared Accountability Guide here that was developed in partnership with local governments and community-based partners as a way to embed accountability with community-based organizations as cities are developing climate action plan processes. So I think this provides a great framework for how everyone and others can think about how to be held accountable to the commitments that they're making through transparent and authentic ways. So as we move on into the workshop, I encourage folks to think about not only how we can create new equity-focused metrics to measure how we're, advancing equitable outcomes in our work, but also how we can make sure that we're held accountable for them and accountability is embedded into our work. All right, I see a lot of questions coming in. Amanda, how much time do we have before we need to move to the next section? Do we have time to answer some of these now?
-2 minutes.
-2
so I would say,
okay,
let's answer these in the chat and then as we go forward.
All right, I'll answer some of the questions in the chat after we move to the next section. But now I want to, here we go. We're going to move on now to the speakers for the workshop today. And as Amanda had said, we're going to have 3 great presentations today. The first from National Grid and Eversource Energy, the second from Efficiency Vermont, and third from Puget Sound Energy, that will provide some case study examples of how their organizations are working to embed equity in their work. And we're going to first hear about how equity is being incorporated into utility programs kind of at an organizational wide level, then dig more into equity in program design, and then lastly, more into that stakeholder engagement, that procedural equity piece. And we hope these presentations will give folks some ideas of how you can do similar work at your organization. And after the 3 presentations, we're going to have time for folks to discuss in small groups ideas that they have, questions they have to develop new equity metrics for their work. So now we're going to move on to our first speakers. We're going to hear from Ruth Georges, the Supervisor for Equity, Strategic Partnership, and Workforce Development at Eversource Energy, and Amanda Formica, Senior Analyst at National Grid. And they're going to speak about the work that their utilities have been doing to measure equity in Massachusetts energy efficiency programs. And I will now pass it over to them. They'll have 15 minutes to speak to you all, and then we'll have time afterwards for questions directly for them. So please post questions in the chat as they come up, and I'll now turn it over to Amanda and Ruth.
Thanks so much, Ariel. Good morning, everyone. My name is Amanda Formica. As Ariel said, I work at National Grid in Massachusetts, and I'll let Ruth introduce herself as well.
Good morning again, everyone. Ruth Georges with Eversource. Again, I'm across all 3 states for our corporation, and I have a pleasure of being with you today and learning more about and around this work.
Thanks. Let's go to the next slide. In the next 15, there we are. So in the next 15 minutes, you're going to learn about the approach to equity that we're taking in Massachusetts, and a little bit about how we came to conceptualize and center equity in our energy efficiency programs. Specifically, you'll hear about some of the key evaluations that are providing a baseline from which we can begin monitoring and tracking our progress toward greater equity. You'll hear about the efforts of our statewide Equity Working Group, or EWG as we call it, and how that work is both informing current and future program design and implementation tactics. You'll also hear about some of the metrics that we are using to further equity in our programs. Hopefully you'll come away with some ideas and additional questions to spark further exploration of equity for you all in your programs as well. Next slide. Great. First, it starts with organizational commitments. So at National Grid, we're strong supporters of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and as a company believe in the clean energy future that's affordable and accessible for all. Half of the components of our responsible business charter outline the actions that we're taking across our US and UK service territory to ensure that our staff and our workforce reflect the diversity of the communities that we serve, and that as a company, we're contributing to a sustainable economy for all. And the work that we're doing in energy efficiency, that's the focus of this presentation today, is one example of this larger effort. Next slide.
Thanks for that, Amanda. So for Eversource, we're New England's largest energy delivery company, delivering safe and reliable energy to approximately 4 million electric and natural gas customers in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. In Connecticut, our electric service territory includes like 149 towns and covers about 4,400 square miles. Our natural gas service territories includes about 74 towns and covers 2,632 square miles. Similar in Massachusetts, it's about 2,273 square miles of services of gas and electric that we cover, and about 5,600 in New Hampshire. We take all those territories really seriously. We take providing those services to our customers as a key component of successfully reaching and servicing them. We are a leader in clean energy, and our goal is to be carbon neutral by 2030. A big supporter and engaging in renewable generation of energy with a wind partnership with Oyster to develop up to 4,000 megawatts of clean energy, and continuing to develop our solar development operations of 22 Eversource facilities over the next few years, with an emission benefit of taking 7,600 cars off of the road permanently. Our energy storage development and work continues to grow as we're developing innovative storage projects that reduce the need for fossil fuel power generation while improving power quality and reliability. And some may be familiar with our electric vehicles. Expanding our distribution network is important to us. We're trying to enable the installation of 3,500 charging stations. And we continue to lead within energy efficiency as being, initially number one energy efficiency providers in the nation. We're right now currently at 2, trying to make our way back up there, and saving customers more than 1 billion kWh of energy a year, and reducing carbon dioxide emissions by more than 4 million metric tons. Our award-winning solutions include our demand response programs, our connected solution programs, and we have also a huge commitment that we have made around diversifying our workforce. And through that, we are investing $331 million into supplier diversity, 4 million in diverse and social agencies. About 40% of that includes increasing leadership of diverse individuals in our corporation, and 48% of that's going to go to external hires of minority and females, and 53% of diverse external candidates. And through that, we're trying to build a pipeline where we are changing what it means to be, to work in our workforce, so we can continue to lead on the fronts of clean energy.
Great, next slide. Then, of course, we are 2 out of 6 of the companies in Massachusetts that together form Mass Save. We administer the energy efficiency programs collectively. And we'll go to the next slide. Great, now into the meat of it. So when we talk about equity in our energy efficiency programs, our focus is on increasing program participation across a set of several priority customer groups that you see here on the screen, recognizing that many people fall into multiple of these groups. These are our priority groups because fundamentally there may be obstacles for them to participating, whether it's due to finances, communication barriers, or because of decision-making ability in the building that they live in. So for us, those groups include low income, which is up to 60% of state median income, moderate income, which is 61 to 80% of state median income, English isolated customers, or also known as customers with limited English proficiency, renters and landlords, and small and micro-sized businesses. The two other key elements of our equity discussions include how we can strengthen partnerships with municipal governments and community-based organizations, particularly those that represent state designated by state of Massachusetts environmental justice communities, as well as how we can strengthen our involvement in workforce development so that we have a larger, more diverse and well-trained energy efficiency workforce that reflects the communities that we serve and that meets the changing needs of the energy efficiency programs. And this definition is very much place-based in the context of Massachusetts and the feedback from stakeholders that we've received and is shared. It's these groups are shared in definition between the members of our Energy Efficiency Advisory Council, or EEAC, and program administrator staff, PAs as we call ourselves. And we recognize that your state or region might have a definition that looks very different from this. Next slide.
So through the residential non-participant study that we administered over 2013, 2017, we found there are serious gaps in participation in our programs. So first, we have to understand where we are in terms of equity to inform where we're going. Over the last 3 years, program administrators such as National Grid, Eversource, and our other PAs have completed several pieces of research, both inside and outside our formal evaluation framework, that are key in helping us to get a comprehensive picture of who is and who's not participating in our energy efficiency programs. They also help us answer how much individuals are participating, how they differ by geography, what are the barriers to participation, and how those barriers differ from across priority groups to affect both program awareness and participation. Overall evaluation is ongoing, but as a form of informing our current and near-term program design, we're going to call out some key findings. Pictured here are some results from our residential non-participant customer profile study, which looks at data from this time frame, and it did find differences in awareness and participation in these priority groups, and we are really thinking through how do we continue to critically think how we engage with these populations. Next slide, please. So this map here, produced with the data from the same non-participant customer profile study, it incorporates census data that's also helping us to understand and share with stakeholders at the census block level which communities and priority groups require additional outreach. And we find this map to be quite valuable as we track our performance in reaching more priority customers that have a lower program participation rate. Next slide. In parallel, our CNI and non-participant customer profile studies showed that small businesses actually participate at a similar rate as larger businesses, but micro businesses need more attention. And micro businesses tend to be businesses that are not, let's say, one designated space at one time. They have a high percentage, they could have a high percentage of use, they could be seasonal. And within this data, we are able to parse out which specific industries the small and micro businesses fall into the required additional, so we can kind of inform our additional outreach efforts to reach more micro businesses. Next slide. These are the two pieces of research from outside of our formal EM, and V framework that are also informing our current equity efforts that we want to call out. The first is a statewide energy efficiency workforce development needs assessment, which has helped us get a better understanding of the demographic gaps in our current workforce compared to the communities we serve. as well as get a sense of contractors and employers' needs broken down by job category. For example, there's a much larger need for weatherization, HVAC workers compared to architects and engineers, depending on if it's C&I or first residential. And we wanted to do this and kind of pair with, what regions we also see have low program participation rates. Next slide, please. Language is also a big component of what we're thinking about through the lens of equity. So research on the language customer journey has also helped us get a better sense of where and how we can improve program delivery for multilingual customers, particularly at key points of communication and with the customer. And it's informing future additional research in this area, including more detailed customer journey maps for Spanish, Portuguese, and Mandarin Chinese speakers that is currently underway, in a comprehensive language access plan that we're going to begin in 2022. So we're not only interpreting, translating, materials and resources, but we are understanding which resources and materials and collateral that we have that need to be translated in what particular language and where they need to be marketed and advertised that's place-based, that work for our customers, so that we are meeting them where they're at. So for example, depending on the cultural diversity, using cultural competency to inform our marketing and the customer's journey, to make sure that we're properly interpreting the data and the findings to translate the information in a way that reaches our bilingual customers. Next slide.
In addition to being informed by data, as program administrators, our close and ongoing communication with a variety of stakeholders is really critical to informing our program design, particularly with regard to equity. The governor-appointed Energy Efficiency Advisory Council, as I had mentioned before, EEAC, forms a primary vehicle for that ongoing stakeholder feedback for us. In the summer of 2020, for the first time, the EEAC convened the Equity Working Group, which began meeting twice a month to gather focus groups of stakeholders representing the priority groups we mentioned before, and various topics to better understand their barriers to participating in programs, ideas for how to remove barriers, and to create recommendations for how equity can be better represented in our 2022 to 2024 energy efficiency plan that we're actually going to be filing at the end of next week. So the EWG is comprised of representatives of the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, 5 voting counselors from the EEAC, 4 PA representatives, members of the EEAC consultant team, members of the Low-Income Energy Affordability Network, and the local Green Justice Coalition. And the EWG proposed a set of 75 recommendations that are viewable online that they proposed to the full EEAC to inform our 2022 to 24 plan. And those recommendations were approved back in February. And National Grid, Eversource, and our fellow PAs we've worked really hard over the last number of months to integrate as many of these recommendations as we can into our upcoming plan that we're going to be filing, and are going to continue to be active participants in the EWG moving forward. Next slide. Transparency and access to data is another way that we're working to address equity. There's a wealth of data that we have available on masssavedata.com. And I'll point out that our newly launched this year residential customer profile dashboard makes it easier for stakeholders and folks in municipalities to view socioeconomic and energy efficiency participation and savings data over time. We also have a counterpart commercial and industrial profile customer profile dashboard available on masssavedata.com. Next slide. So over the next few slides, we'd like to give you a sense of where our programs are headed with regard to equity, with the efforts influenced by the Equity Working Group and other stakeholder input. As I mentioned, we're going to be filing our 2022 to 24 3-year plan next week. The draft plan is available on eeac.org. That's the website of the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council. Our plan greatly focuses on furthering equity. In fact, it's together with electrification, it's one of the 2 primary focuses of the plan. And there's a few highlights on this slide. So in the income eligible programs, we're increasing our ambition related to fuel switching from oil and propane to heat pumps paired with weatherization, and are upskilling staff at community action agencies who administer or who implement our program to build their capacity. We're also increasing multilingual and multicultural marketing with a focus on the Spanish and Portuguese language customer journeys like Ruth was talking about, as well as more enhanced HVAC incentives paired with 100% weatherization and up to a $7,000 per customer incentive to help moderate income folks mitigate barriers to weatherization. There's definitely a recognition that there are a number of residents who are not low income but are still struggling for various reasons, and we want to ensure that energy efficiency is accessible to them. Next slide. In the C&I sector, we're taking a deeper equity focus through small business offerings, including our Main Streets effort that's going to take a larger focus on environmental justice communities, more marketing and outreach in Spanish and Portuguese, and collaboration with ethnic and minority small business associations. And I think I didn't mention our 100% weatherization incentive for all rental units. And then also we're greatly expanding our programming with municipalities and community-based organizations through our Mass Save Community First Partnership Program. So we're increasing our commitment to 20 teams across 30 plus municipalities, which is up from 9 teams this year, with a focus on environmental justice communities. We'll be hiring a dedicated implementation vendor to support all the teams, and are introducing an energy advocate role to the program for each of the teams that borrows from the public health sector. So together with workforce development, these programmatic changes to better target particular customer segments also mean significant investments. They amount to our estimate is over $665 million over the next 3 years. Next slide. Then in the area of workforce development, we're making a nearly $50 million commitment over the next 3 years, which includes $36 million to the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center for clean energy workforce development in EJ communities, which is part of the Massachusetts Climate Act from this year. And then a key component of our PA workforce efforts is the Clean Energy Pathways Program, which is a fully paid 9-month internship in high growth energy efficiency jobs with a focus on diverse participants who are 18 to 24 years old. And we're also planning targeted outreach and training to bring more diverse business enterprises into energy efficiency program service delivery statewide. So in aggregate, the PA workforce programs, we plan to reach over 12,000 energy efficiency professionals over the next 3 years. Next slide.
Thanks, Amanda. So finally, a key component of the continuous improvements we're making around metrics. This cycle from the first slide, we showed us to measure and track our progress. This slide represents a summary of 6+ months of discussion within the equity working group with the evaluation staff on the targets we'll be using to benchmark our progress moving forward. In general, we are executing distributional, procedural equity, quite a bit of it in combination of increased investments and increased participation across the priority groups, mostly using 2021 as our baseline year for measurement, and are committing to reporting out on these at least annually. We have set aggressive targets that we're trying to strike a balance between aspirational and achievable, as we understand that there have people historically that have not been serviced through our program, and we want to take a deeper dive by adding more investments within those populations to increase, yes, exposure and awareness, but also participation in our programs. Next slide, please. So each metric is going to require a different PA and vendor staff and different processes to track. We are going to be tracking things differently. We're going to creating new tracking methods as some of this work that we're doing is new. How we're doing this work is somewhat new. As the metrics themselves are in the process of getting their final tweaks, the next steps will be to gather staff over the coming weeks to have conversations about each of these metrics, to align on assumptions and processes and procedures, and prepare for regular reporting. I think that's a really important point to figure out, to kind of underscore, that even after you have set these metrics, equity metrics, as a part of your program design, that you really have to pull in your strategy, your business intelligence, your implementation, your evaluation, your lead vendors, to then say, now we know that these are the equity targets that we're trying to reach. How are we going to do that collectively? What new procedures do we need to stand up? What new reporting do we need to stand up to track the impacts of this, and to make sure that our customers are not, their experience is not impeded upon the new procedures that we are going to have to create in order to engage them. So we are anticipating that tracking reporting will be a team effort and will require a new level of staff time to bring us to, this exciting new place on our journey to incorporate equity into our energy efficiency programs. Next slide.
Great. Apologies, we went a couple minutes over time, but we'll just end with our continuous improvement cycle from the beginning of the presentation, where new data and reporting are going to inform future stages of how we continue to look at equity and design our future programs. And the last slide, just for people can take a look at the links that we have here, that link to all of the research. Sorry, on the next slide. Links to all of the research that we referred to. There's a lot of learning and iterating going on as we advance our journey toward equity. So we encourage questions. Thanks all.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for sharing all of this information with us. We're a minute over time, but I want to flag a couple of questions in the chat that maybe you could address now. One person asked if you could share reports, which this slide I think has all of the reports, and the RFP that you use to procure evaluators. Is that something that's available or could be shared with folks?
So these are the primary reports we referred to. I don't, we don't typically post RFPs, but that may be something we can follow up with you offline on, Ariel.
Okay. Ruth, somebody asked if there's an annual revenue definition between small businesses and micro businesses.
Currently, as I understand it, there is not, and as a part of setting up our equity metrics, it's going equity targets. We're going to be able to do parts of that in the work, but currently it has not been. Our deeper analysis and attention to micro businesses has come from the study that the learnings we've received from the study. Amanda, did you want to layer in?
Yeah, there's more information in the study, but we don't measure businesses by revenue size. It's by kilowatt and therm usage.
Awesome. Then just two more questions. Somebody asked, they'd like to know about the funding sources to support customers to fuel switch from oil, propane, heat to electric heat pumps. They said in Seattle, there's many customers with oil heat who aren't able to switch. So wondering how you all are doing that.
The funding for that comes from electric ratepayers. So electric ratepayers are paying for that. There is not a surcharge on oil and propane, interestingly, and it's something that I know it depends on the regulatory structure, state to state.
Yeah. Great. And then the last question that I saw, somebody would love to hear from you, Amanda, more about the no-cost offerings for renters, and if there's any reports or other information on the history and performance of the program. I think they can find some of that here potentially, right?
One of the biggest new offers for renters is our 100% weatherization offer for all rental units. And we know that a lot of folks who are moderate income or low income also are renters, so they'll be able to access those other incentives we mentioned. We do report regularly to the EEAC in our quarterly KPIs on renter participation across different programs, but we're going to as we continue to report on the new metrics that Ruth talked about, there'll be some more data available online.
Awesome, thank you. Those are all the questions I saw in the chat. If folks have more questions for Amanda or Ruth, please feel free to put those in and they can respond to them in the chat as well. All right, so we're going to move into our, I see some more questions coming in, but we're going to move into our first break now. Amanda, what do you think? Should we make this a 5-minute break to get back on track or have our 10-minute break?
How about we split the difference and do 7 minutes?
All right, we're gonna have a 7-minute break right now. I'm gonna get us to that slide. Here we are. And all right, we'll see you all back in 7 minutes. Move it up to here. There we go.
All right, welcome back from the break, everybody. Ariel, if you go to our next slide, which you already have done, I'm so excited to introduce everyone to our next presentation and our next speaker. Lauren Wentz is joining us today. She is a program manager with Efficiency Vermont. She's going to be focusing about her organization's work on equity metrics and program design. So take it away, Lauren.
Great. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up.
Perfect.
Fantastic. All right, really happy to be with everybody today. The focus of what I'll hopefully talk about in 15 minutes sharp is around the process that we've undertaken at Efficiency Vermont around how to embed equity in the programs that we design and manage, and kind of the process that we've gone through over the last number of years to get to where we are today and where we're headed. Next slide. So a quick, thank you. So a quick kind of agenda at the top, kind of first give an overview of Efficiency Vermont and VEIC, the larger organization that Efficiency Vermont is a part of. Then cover equity and program design in broad strokes, discuss the portfolio approach that Efficiency Vermont has taken, have a program deep dive on 2 specific programs that we've developed in the last few years, and then talk about the evaluation matrix that we've used and how we're adapting that moving forward. So next slide. So just very quickly, so VEIC is a Vermont-based nonprofit organization focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions by becoming a leader in decarbonization. So we are about 300 plus, give or take, team of folks working on energy efficiency, building decarbonization strategies, and transportation electrification. VEIC as an organization also provides a wealth of services from customers and businesses to states and governments, and our work spans the United States, as this map shows. VEIC also administers Efficiency Vermont, the nation's first statewide regulated energy efficiency utility. Next slide. So Efficiency Vermont is essentially helping the state to transition to a more affordable and cleaner future. We work with partners throughout the state of Vermont to save customers money, strengthen the state's economy, and lower carbon emissions. And at Efficiency Vermont specifically, I work on our residential services team, focusing on developing and managing our low-income and multifamily housing programs. So essentially, where are we at? I just want to kind of say this at the top with the development of our equity metrics. We're kind of in between categories of folks, I would say, who responded to the survey ahead of today's session. So while programmatically, kind of at the program level, we've designed and implemented programs that really try to take a hard look at what does equity mean and how can we deliver our programs equitably. From an organizational level, we are still in that phase of developing and determining specifically what we want our equity metrics to be, and kind of trying to also acknowledge that there are entities out there nationally who are doing this hard work, such as ACEEE, and really wanting to adapt what we are going to be looking forward to our next 3-year performance period with the state, and implementing those in that time. So I would say that we've started off running at the ground level, but we're still learning how to walk specifically at the organizational level. All right, next slide. So equity and program design. So I kind of wanted to start by zooming out first. So what are some of the guideposts that at Efficiency Vermont we've used specifically in our low-income programs to help think about what does equity look like in this way? Next slide. So this is a really interesting impact plane I came across a while ago. What's interesting is that this is not specifically designed or developed for the energy efficiency space, but I found it really compelling and applicable. So it was originally developed as a framework for thinking about equity and economic evaluation, specific actually to investments in the health sector. And so what's interesting though is that if we kind of change the lens a little bit and think about efficiency as stated here around energy efficiency, it's actually really interesting to think about on kind of the X and the Y axis. when we think about programs and the impacts we want them to have for customers of all sizes, be them homeowners, renters, property owners, business owners, schools, institutions, is there the ability to deliver a maximum benefit from an energy efficiency perspective, and then also the ability to deliver a maximum benefit or deliver harm, unintended harm, from an equity perspective. And what I'd like to kind of just put out there is that kind of a few questions just to consider, and these are ones that we've thought about too internally, is what are the ways that energy efficiency impacts and equity impacts have historically been seen as mutually exclusive, right? So if we're thinking about cost effectiveness screening, right, and having that be the driver of what we can deliver and offer to customers from an energy efficiency standpoint, does that limit or inhibit our ability to center equity, right? And so that might mean prioritizing beneficial efficiency impact over equity impact. But looking at that in a different way may lead to a different orientation for how to design and deliver programs. Another kind of question is there a sweet spot? And is there no one answer across our portfolio of programs? Might some programs need to prioritize energy efficiency impact and beneficial and have equity impact as secondary, or in some cases the reverse? So just a really interesting way of considering kind of the ways to view how to the impacts an energy efficiency program can have with respect to equity and energy efficiency. I'd put out there that the sweet spot ideally is that upper right quadrant, but certainly that's hard to achieve, I think, as probably many of us experience. Next slide. So these are some of the equity impacts that we've really been trying to think about most recently around our programs as we've designed them, and kind of looking forward to the ones that we look to launch in 2022 and beyond. So proportional distribution of program funds. So that can be seen as certainly the percentage of one's budget that goes to serving targeted population. At Efficiency Vermont, we focus on low income specifically. So there's that approach, but there's also within a given budget, how do you distribute those dollars or those incentives or those efforts to the targeted population, and what is the approach there? So I'll cover that a little bit later. Prioritizing need for customers, how to kind of right size a program that's offered and the services that are delivered based on a customer's need, and how do you define that? Increasing access, addressing household benefit, and also generational benefit. So how do we deliver programs and design programs in such a way that really center energy efficiency and justify the programs that we are offering from that lens first and foremost? That is our kind of our mandate from the state of Vermont, but how at the same time do we deliver household benefit? What does that look like? And how do we deliver and try to address generational benefit? And what does that look like? And then increased affordability. All right, next slide. So a portfolio approach. One of the things I actually picked up from ACEEE years and years ago when I first started Efficiency Vermont is kind of the ideal approach is to kind of have a portfolio of offerings for a target population, let's say low income, some that go wide. So let's say a really kind of light touch per customer, but can serve a lot of customers, and some programs that go really deep and are super comprehensive and kind of whole home oriented. And so at Efficiency Vermont, we're really trying to continue to address our serving low income customers in need based on this portfolio approach. And we've had a real evolution of the portfolio of programs that we offer over the recent years. So I'm gonna take a quick dive into that. So if we advance. So we had what I call a watershed moment in 2019. So what that watershed moment was a kind of complete overhaul of the way we looked at qualifying low-income customers for our kind of standard BEAR program that has been around since 2009, called our Targeted High Use program. And essentially, we used to recruit folks into this program through direct mail, and we would serve approximately 325 low-income customers every year with this comprehensive program that we delivered through contracts with our state's weatherization agency partners. Essentially, in 2019, we decided to mass market versus target outreach to customers across the state. And what happened was we got a tremendous tens of thousands of people responding. And the challenge is that the vast majority of those customers did not qualify for that single program that we offered because the qualification criteria was around high energy use, specifically high electric energy use. And so what we realized is that we had this great program that was highly successful, delivered great benefit impact to customers, it improved affordability, all of those things. But we realized that we were disqualifying customers for that program, even though they were in higher need than those customers who were previously qualifying. So this required us to take a deep required us to take stock of the programs that we offered, how they were inadvertently inequitable, and what did we want to do about it. And so one of the things that we did was looked at the DOE's low-income energy affordability data tool, the LEAD, L-E-A-D tool, highly recommended as a resource if folks haven't taken a look. And one of the things I noticed was that low-income customers across the state of Vermont have on average 3.6 times higher energy burden than moderate or high income customers. And sometimes that actual percentage is as high as 28%. So this, along with a number of other factors, essentially had us refocusing our efforts on centering energy burden as the primary criteria to figure out which program a customer would qualify for. But these are some of the other objectives at the same time we actually really wanted to hone in on and have continued to hone in on since that time. So we wanted to continue to serve more customers. So we wanted to not just serve 350 customers per year, we wanted to drastically scale up, but we also knew that our budget wasn't scaling up at the same degree as well. So how do you kind of fit that square peg into a round hole? We wanted to create a consistent process for program qualification so that it was equitable and consistent and fair for any customer who gave a call to our customer support department and was not objective and it was repeatable rather. We wanted to right-size the degree of service that was provided to customers based on their need. So a super comprehensive service for those who were in highest energy burden versus a lower comprehensive program for those who had lower energy burden. We wanted to continue to address affordability. We wanted to center energy burden, and we wanted to find ways to really address the co-benefits. And there are all sorts of ways to define co-benefits, be it health or generational wealth, or what have you, comfort in a home. But we wanted to find a way to kind of address that simultaneous or alongside of the energy efficiency benefits too. So let's advance. So what did this end up looking like? Let's click one. So in 2009, or since 2009, we've been offering our Target High Use program, again, delivered by the weatherization agencies. It is a program that replaces all inefficient appliances, installs cold climate heat pump water heaters at no cost to customers. But that was the only program that we offered. And if we click again, as we really diversified our portfolio in 2019, we, after that watershed moment of reorienting around energy burden, we introduced the appliance replacement voucher program. And then click once more, please. And then also in 2021, we introduced a lighter touch version of Target High Use Light, which we've called Target High Use Light, and then also the Energy Savings Kit program. So this is our current portfolio of low-income programs. We have others at Efficiency Vermont that also low-income customers qualify for, but these are kind of the main four. And they go from least comprehensive to most comprehensive, but also lowest project cost average to highest project cost average. So if we advance, so this is essentially the matrix for how a customer, talking about process, qualifies for any one of those four programs. So if we kind of click through, we focus on less than 80% AMI, area median income. We then have a factor of whether or not a customer uses greater than or less than 5,000 kWh per year. We then assess on the spot what a customer's energy burden is, if it's greater than 6% or less than 6%. And what that does is creates four program channels: high use, high burden, high use, low burden, low use, high burden, and low use, low burden. And this is how we are defining customer need. And what that ends up funneling down into are those four programs that I just described in the last slide. So if we advance one more time, talking about the qualification process. So one of the things we wanted to do to increase access and reduce barriers to access was to continue to make the process for qualification simple for customers, quick, and consistent. And so customer would calls into our customer support folks, and over the course of a 20 to 30-minute phone call, goes through the entire process and has an application filled out and sent via DocuSign if they have access to a computer, or by paper mail if that's their preference, or they don't have access to internet or a computer. So this is a snapshot of the Excel-based qualification tool that we developed that our customer support folks use. And so there are all these inputs around: do you rent or own your home, where you live, what your household income is, gross, earned, and unearned. The factors that we ask are modeled after the weatherization application. And on the spot, the tool calculates whether or not the customer income qualifies. And then the tool also calculates which of those programs the customer qualifies for. So it automatically is a very smooth process for customers. It's a consistent process for our staff, and it matches a customer's need with the scope and scale of the program that they are eligible for. So if we advance one more slide, this is a graphic that represents those 4 programs in just a different visual way. So as you kind of go on the x-axis, it's kind of the low, moderate, and high kind of degree of usage and burden, so kind of what we call impact. And then as you go on the y-axis, from our less comprehensive program to our most comprehensive program. So the darkest blue circle is our target high use program, and then the lightest blue circle is our energy saving kit program. So kind of creating these tier approaches in ways that center energy burden still, and really distribute the program dollars we have in equitable, consistent, and fair ways is one of the main ways that we've addressed kind of equity in our program design and the evolution of our portfolio. All right, next slide. So I wanted to take a chance to do a quick deep dive on 2 specific programs. One I've mentioned and one actually I haven't yet mentioned, to kind of give a little bit more context to how we're thinking about equity as we've designed and launched these programs. So let's advance. The first one is the appliance replacement voucher program. I'll say this was and has been a hugely successful and popular program. We distributed just over 1,200 vouchers in the first 4 months of the program in 2019. And it continues to be a highly popular program today. So what are the basics of the program? Customers who qualify receive a voucher. It looks just like this picture that's custom made out to them. And it's eligible for the replacement of an existing refrigerator, freezer, washing machine, dehumidifier, or air conditioner. And up to, originally the program was launched at a value of $1,200. For budgetary purposes and to try to figure out what our levers might be, we reduced the value of the voucher in 2021, but are figuring out where our sweet spot will be for 2022. The purpose and the intention is to essentially either completely pay for or drastically contribute to the replacement of an inefficient appliance in a customer's home. A customer would redeem this voucher at a participating independent retailer across the state, and the voucher requires and includes the delivery, installation, and haul away of the old appliance. So what are the ways that this program specifically addresses equity? So we focus on high energy burden. This program, again, is eligible for customers who use less than 5,000 kWh per year, but who have high energy burden, which means that practically speaking, if folks have either a non-functioning or a highly inefficient appliance that needs replacement, they will seek out a replacement at a rent-a-center that has historically predatory loan practices, or they will Craigslist it or pick it up on the side of the road, or make it work for longer than is useful, healthy, or feasible. And so by removing those barriers, it's a huge improvement for customers in terms of access to efficient technology. The other aspect of equity that we center here is customer choice. Many times in programs that serve low-income customers, there's a single item that customers have access to, and it's very prescriptive as to what model that is. Maybe it's one of 3 choices. And this program really allows the customer to say, you can go to the store, it's a requirement to buy an Energy Star appliance, but you can select the model. and we're not going to prescribe what that might be. One of the other benefits that I didn't list here is that the generational benefit of having a new appliance. If a customer then moves, sells their house, they can bring that with them. And many times that hasn't been something necessarily that low-income customers in Vermont have had access to. We also leverage independent retailers as participating, and as I said, the generational benefit. We've also had customers in this program who, let's say, are now taking medication that hasn't been historically kept cold in their old refrigerator, or a customer whose washing machine no longer works and they've been going to a laundromat every Sunday despite working 2-shift jobs. So addressing what those household benefits might be and doing it in a way that centers customer need and actually their autonomy and sense of advocacy has been a really successful way of implementing an energy efficiency program. All right, next slide. So another program I haven't mentioned is our rental property free products program. This is something we launched in the last 6 or so months. There's 2 kind of legs of it. One is meant for renters specifically, and then one is meant for property owners. And the property owners version is going to be launching imminently in the next, I would say, 3 or 4 months. The renter version is brand new to Efficiency Vermont. So this is providing renters with access to LEDs, and water saving devices at no cost, shipped directly to their home by our third-party vendor. And so what's great about this is that we can scale the selection of what's included. We can add additional products if we want through our vendor, and the customers, the renters, don't really have to leave their home to be able to access it. If a renter doesn't have access to internet or a computer, our customer support folks can place the order on their behalf. In terms of designing for equity, having this be a no-cost offer for renters, having it be directly accessible to them and not necessarily through their property owner or landlord is a huge benefit in terms of how to equitably serve renters. In the state of Vermont, much like many other states in the country, the vast majority of renters are low income. And so we really try to think about how to serve renters in the same way that we think about how to serve low income customers, specifically through the lens of making programs more equitable. So a quick look at what that site looks like if we advance one. All right, this is the landing page for that site. If we advance one more. These are the products that can be selected and added to the cart, and then advance one more. And this is what the cart looks like. So meant to be super simple and really easily accessed. All right, so if we continue once more, the last part I wanted to touch on was the evaluation matrix that we have in the past used to evaluate, are our low-income programs having the impact that we want them to have? So I want to talk about that and give a brief overview. And then I want to kind of put forth how would this matrix look like through the lens of equity and how well we are achieving our desired equity impacts and the outcomes we're looking to have. So if we advance one, so evaluation from an evaluation matrix perspective, this is a great picture for me. It's unclear if it's a sunset or a sunrise. And that's kind of the point. At Efficiency Vermont, we are evaluating on an annual basis. Do we keep, change, or modify or sunset our programs? And so what's interesting is that regardless of what the end answer is, the process is actually the same. And so a kind of a question to put out there is kind of what tools do you use to evaluate if your programs are effective, if they deliver the desired impact, and if they meet the goals? This is one of a few different tools that we use at Efficiency Vermont. All right, so if we advance, all right. So the way this matrix is set up, first we have our criteria, and these are ones that we've kind of come up with within a low-income program, but there are many others that certainly could be included here. Then as a team, we define, if we click one more, what each of those criteria are. So mutually agreed upon definitions for what those criteria are. So are we all talking about the same thing and understanding that these criteria are defined as such? And then what's really interesting about this matrix is you take each of your programs, if we advance, and you rank them on a scale of 1 to 10 for each individual criteria. And then what's really helpful about this kind of tool is that on a program by program basis, you kind of get your total in the columns, right? So program 1, 70.8, right? And how is that doing overall? How impactful are your programs? And are they delivering on the desired goals? What's also interesting is that if you look horizontally instead, you're suddenly able to see the individual criteria where you might be lagging or might be really, really ahead, right? So in this case, it's really clear that actually in this example, I just kind of randomly put in these numbers for the sake of example here, these programs are not accessible, right? In this made up world, right? Also, they may not be cost effective as defined by not a cost effective screening, but defined by the cost to deliver them based on compared to the savings that are documented. And also certainly brand visibility. Now, to some utilities, organizations, brand visibility is really important, but what the context is here is if customers, a target population that we're trying to serve doesn't associate that Efficiency Vermont can deliver, for example, services that are meaningful, impactful, and equitable, are they going to return to us and seek us out for when they need further assistance? And if we want to really move the marker on affordability, energy burden, then we need to make sure that there is visibility from a customer perspective into the work that we're doing and the work that we can deliver. And so the value of this matrix has been to help us decide, do we sunset programs, right? Are they actually achieving the desired results? Now, if we advance one more time, if we kind of reoriented this matrix to something more in the lens of equity, what could this look like? And this is something that we are going to be kind of implementing and using more in the coming year. So these are some sample criteria that I'm looking forward to us looking at within our programs. The extent to which we're engaging stakeholders, how diverse are our participants across the state. Vermont is a rural state, but we've also got urban centers, right? And so we need to understand and really address the ways in which we are equitably distributing our resources geographically. The spend proportionality as well as the savings proportionality relative to the overall proportion of the population of the state of Vermont that is low income. How accessible are our programs in terms of language, co-benefits, how much do we leverage CBOs, and are we enabling first to market? So one of the things I've really tried to focus on around equity is in what ways can a program actually introduce, make accessible at no or very, very low cost, advanced energy efficiency technology to target low income customers who would otherwise not have access. And that's a really big factor in our kind of drive for equity. Oftentimes low-income customers are last to market. And so if you kind of look at what rank these programs hypothetically in this way, how would they score? And then if we think back to that kind of that plane at the beginning of my slides, how would the first matrix and this matrix actually land? Kind of how would your programs land in the first, second, third, fourth quadrant? And just taking stock of that overall. So that is, we advance one more slide. That is essentially kind of what I wanted to share today. No, it's a lot to dive in. I've not at all been monitoring the chat. So if there are questions, I certainly would be happy to answer.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lauren. That was great. Folks, feel free to keep putting questions in the chat. We'll get to a few now, and then we'll keep monitoring the chat after we move on to the next section as well. First question for you, Lauren, is a question about, are there limits on fuel? So for example, can customers purchase gas stoves, or are you incentivizing electric?
Great question. In the programs that I specifically talked about, it's electric based. So in our Target High Use and Target High Use Light program, we can replace efficient electric appliances, or sorry, we replace inefficient electric appliances. And then we install CCHPs and heat pump water heaters in homes with electric resistance heat. And that is because those programs are funded with the state's energy efficiency charge.
Got it. Great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Second question for you. Can you describe a little bit more about how you're scoring the programs for each criteria category?
Yeah. So when we initially deployed the matrix, it was with internal stakeholders and then Fed who individually ranked and we aggregated scores. And then we also leveraged customer satisfaction surveys to augment those scores as well to factor in. One of the things that I'm looking forward to doing moving forward is to directly engaging stakeholder groups to also help complete that matrix on their own to also feed into that.
Wonderful. And then we'll do one more question, and then there'll be an additional one left over and maybe more in the chat for after. But
Sure.
the last one we'll talk about here is, are you running data analysis to inform your program matrix evaluations?
Great question. We have not yet in 2021. What's interesting, actually, is that we are have not yet figured out the program level to also talk to our EM&V folks as well around how do we assess the impacts that COVID have had on home energy use, supply chain shortages, and access to programs, delivering of the services of the programs that customers are eligible for. And so we are kind of wrestling with, from a data perspective, kind of energy use if folks are home more, right? And we're looking at reducing energy burden and energy usage, electric usage as part of that. How do we account for that? So that's something we are, from a data perspective, really looking to dive into, having cracked the nut for the most recently participated customers.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Lauren, this is wonderful. We really appreciate it. Folks, Lauren can keep going in the chat for a little while if more questions come to mind, and then we'll move on to our final presentation before we get to the interactive portion. And that is going to be from Diane Strom, who's with us as a strategic engagement lead from Puget Sound Energy. And she's going to be focusing on stakeholder engagement. Welcome, Diane.
Thanks, Amanda. And it's an honor to be here and to really learn from the presenters as well as the attendees today. Like the other presenters, PSE is working to embed equity into our work, and we're early in our journey. If you could go to the next slide, please. So we're, like I said, early in our equity journey, and we understand that the equitable energy solutions must improve the lives of all people, particularly those who shoulder an outsized share of the climate burden, and that our customers have a role to play in decision making. Today, I'll share how we engage customers and stakeholders on developing equity indicators to shape our new draft clean energy implementation plan using the equity lens of accessibility, affordability, and accountability. Next slide. So today I'll quickly provide some background on PSE, the regulations guiding our work, and then talk about our stakeholder engagement process on energy planning metrics, both in how we'll shape success and some lessons learned from the process. And I'll share what's next. Next slide, please. So Puget Sound Energy has been the local energy provider for neighborhoods and communities across Washington for 150 years, providing 1/3 of all the electric and natural gas in our state. We believe energy is essential for communities, and we've committed to creating a clean energy future. Earlier this year, PSE set an aspirational goal to be a beyond net zero carbon company by 2045, and we see clean electricity as one of the pathways to get there, and I'll focus on that today. Next slide. So to set the stage, in 2019, Washington State's governor signed into law the Clean Energy Transformation Act, referred to as CETA. PSE was proud to work with state legislatures to craft this energy policy, which is the most progressive and aggressive in the country. CETA is changing the way we do work. It sets clean electricity goals for all utilities in Washington state. We must be off of coal by the end of 2025, carbon neutral by 2030, and have 100% clean electricity by 2045. We must ensure all customers benefit from the transition to clean electricity, and our energy planning process has evolved to include customer benefits and encourages broader public participation in a new equity advisory group. The rules were finalized at the end of last year, So 2021 is our inaugural year for meeting the CETA requirements. So a lot has gone on. So I'll talk about that for the next couple of slides. Next slide. So I'm particularly going to focus on our Clean Energy Implementation Plan, referred to as the CEIP, which is a new plan born by CETA and expands beyond the traditional integrated resource planning process. The CEIP looks at the short term, specifically, what are we going to do in the next 4 years to deliver on our 2030 and 2045 clean electricity goals, which energy efficiency, demand response, renewable programs, actions, and investments will we make? Like I said, this year is our inaugural process, and we have to file our first CIP by the end of the year. So to achieve our clean electricity goals, PSC must also ensure that the transition to clean energy is equitable. And we're doing that by focusing on customer benefits. That includes customer benefit indicators, which are defined by CETA. They're essentially the outcomes that improve our customer lives. In addition, as we make this transition, we must consider the burdens our customers face. And so we're doing that by determining how those benefits are distributed across all customers and how we reduce burdens for those who bear a disproportionate share of them. And we do this through identifying highly impacted communities and vulnerable populations and measuring progress and reporting. In addition, PSC convened an equity advisory group to advise us on embedding equity into our CIP. Next slide. So the development of the CIP marked the first time PSC sought broad public participation from our customers in energy planning considerations. We began this work earlier this year, and we're facing a regulatory deadline in addition to doing all this work in a pandemic. So we really focused our engagement with customers at 2 key milestones. Early on, to seek input on clean energy values and benefits to then shape our customer benefit indicators, and now on our draft clean energy implementation plan. We've worked to ensure frontline and vulnerable populations who've typically not been involved in resource planning have a voice in the process. As such, we've worked to convene and engage our equity advisory group, build, enhance, and expand relationships with community-based organizations to help reach customers where they're at and through trusted partners, and engage customers at key milestones while working to reduce barriers. In addition, we've engaged PSC's 3 other advisory groups and stakeholders. Next slide. As I mentioned, we formed a new equity advisory group this year to bring voices to the energy planning process that have not traditionally participated and engaged with our other advisory groups. The group was convened in April and is comprised of 13 members representing a diversity of lived experience with local and cultural expertise. The groups represented include Black, Indigenous, and people of color, groups focused on small business, groups focused on other vulnerable populations like seniors and others. Given the regulatory timeline for the Clean Energy Implementation Plan, it's really driven this group's initial work. We've had 9 meetings thus far on the Clean Energy Implementation Plan, with the initial meeting to provide context on energy and then jumping right in to the CIP and to helping inform the equity components of it. The Equity Advisory Group has really been focusing their advice by applying the equity lens of accessibility, affordability, and accountability to accelerate equity. The group has weighed in on our customer benefit indicators, provided input into vulnerability factors to help define our vulnerable populations. They've highlighted barriers and burdens that exist to our customers, like making sure that we have programs available for renters. I think some of the other speakers have talked to that as well. And we've worked with them on developing some guiding principles for our CIP implementation. And I have to add, we also have an equity advisory group member in attendance today. So that's pretty exciting. Next slide, please. In addition to working with our equity advisory group, we also have worked to gain our customer input to inform the customer benefit indicators that we'll use to make decisions and ensure equitable distribution of benefits. To do so, we conducted an informal multilingual survey of residential and business customers, hosted Go2You meetings with community-based organizations representing vulnerable customers, and met with our 4 advisory groups, which combined have about 60 members. We used a variety of tools to help us reach the various audiences through meetings, informal online surveys, targeted emails, our website, social media, and ads. Next slide, please. As a result of this engagement, we learned that the benefits customers envision to the transition to clean electricity include opportunities to improve our communities through outcomes like cleaner air, better public health, new jobs, or different ways for customers to get their electricity. Using customer input, we developed an initial list of indicators and then worked with our 4 advisory groups to further the list that we developed today, and that's what's shown on your screen. These indicators are shaping our program's action and investment decisions and will help ensure all customers benefit from the transition. We're working to develop the metrics behind these indicators and data resources for them, and expect to report out on these in 2022 and thereafter. Next slide, please. Getting to our first ever clean energy implementation plan that includes customer-driven customer benefit indicators and identification of highly impacted communities and vulnerable populations has been a sprint this year. We began engaging our advisory groups in March, convened the Equity Advisory Group in April, and surveyed customers in May. And we've spent the summer and fall working with advisory groups on our various CIP components. A few lessons learned. Utility and regulatory timelines are not community timelines, and strict and short schedules can be a barrier to equity. The efforts we've undertaken are focused on listening and self-directed input rather than always driving to utility outcomes. As such, we've had to broaden our focus, design an approach and timeline to meet customers where they're at, and balancing our approach to develop relationships with our Equity Advisory Group members and community-based organizations rather than an extractive or transactional approach. As an example, our state's original deadline for our clean energy implementation plan was August 15th for our draft and October 1st for our final. We heard over the summer from members of our Equity Advisory Group and other stakeholders, they needed more time to think about the customer benefit indicators and other related CIP topics. In response to this feedback, PSC petitioned our regulator to extend the process to give us that time to engage with advisory groups, to engage on the draft CIP and address feedback between the draft and finals. In addition, we heard from our Equity Advisory Group really the need to develop inclusive, culturally appropriate, and visual educational materials on clean energy. Members reported that frontline and vulnerable communities may not see the benefits of clean energy nor how to get involved, and that's an area for improvement. We also learned that bringing on a group of our Equity Advisory Group who's new to energy, they have a lot of questions and a lot of energy topics that they want to learn about. And so creating the space to where they can ask questions and provide self-directions on what they want to learn. And I'll also note the pandemic really limited our outreach opportunities to mainly online opportunities, and we're seeing fatigue, both with community-based organizations being available to partner on different things, as well as survey fatigue in general. So that's been a limitation in our process thus far. Next slide, please. So some key takeaways when thinking about engaging customers. Set a foundation by understanding who your customers are and the relationships you have within the communities. Who are your customers? Who do they trust? And what's your relationship with those organizations? A key to our success was some internal coordination and partnerships with our outreach and community engagement teams who regularly work with community-based organizations, and were really able to provide us with connections for engagement. In addition, our customer insights team was really able to help us understand customer demographics and work directly with our Equitiy advisory group on developing vulnerability factors for our plan and to gather the data for those. We've also worked to reduce barriers through education, translated and trans-created materials, and compensation for participation. In addition, we've worked to try to make our materials relevant to our customers. What's in it for them? Why should they care about this plan? What are the programs that are of interest to them? What are the outcomes? And then for our Equitiy advisory group, a couple of things to think about is planning early. We developed our framework for the Equitiy advisory group late last year, and then earlier this year started doing some external consultations with stakeholders on the framework and the potential membership. And through that, we placed a lot of emphasis on lived experience and what each member has to offer as an expert of their community and speaking from their realm of expertise, which we're relying on to guide our work. The other thing I'll note is that we've really listened and learned from the Equitiy Advisory Group on the topics that they want to discuss. We've worked to change our approach. If the things weren't working out, we tried to change how we brought materials to the meeting or the length of our meetings, just really trying to dial in kind of what works for this group. And we've sought the group's input on what we discuss, and we'll be talking with them about governance because the group will go on into the future. And we're continuing to work to build trust through this continuous improvement, accountability, and transparency in our efforts. Next slide. So what's next? Working with our customers, advisory groups, and stakeholders, we filed our draft CIP last Friday, in fact. And on Monday, we launched our online open house, a website that acts like a real open house, where customers can come, learn about the plan, and provide feedback. I encourage you to take a look. It's at our online open house. It's psc.com/plan. And then looking ahead, we'll file our final CIP by December 17th. And then in 2022, we'll really begin the implementation process, continuing to engage customers, advisory groups, and stakeholders on our CIP, on program design, on clean energy education, and really, like I said earlier, start to be able to show progress and kind of baseline data related to our customer benefit indicators. Next slide, please. So I'll close with a quote one of our facilitators shared, and I asked her where it came from and she wasn't sure, but it's equity is like the wind and water. You have to keep working away at the stone. And as excited as I am that the CIP is a major milestone for clean energy and ensuring equitable distribution of benefits, it's the first of many. And we know we'll have to continue to listen, learn, and adjust as we move ahead. So thank you for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Diane. That was wonderful. And we've got a bunch of great questions for you in the chat. So we'll get through as many of those as we can in the next few minutes, if that's okay.
Great.
Awesome. Our first question notes that on your webpage, your goals include net zero methane emissions by 2022 in our local distribution system, which is next year. Through what technology and tactics does PSC plan to accomplish this in such a quick timeline?
So my role has specifically focused on the clean energy implementation plan, but I'm happy to bring that back. And if the person will message me directly, I will reach out to the team to learn more. I think that our Beyond Net Zero page has a white paper that describes some of our actions, but if you message me directly, I'll make some connections. Thank you.
That's perfect. And the contact info is also on this slide for anyone who wants to reach out. Next question was, this was in reference to the Equitiy Advisory Group when you had those slides up. And the question is, can you define what accountability means in that context?
I think for accountability as PSE being held accountable, I think part of the guiding principles we're working with our equity advisory group on, as well as our customer benefit indicators, are tracking progress and success in our programs reaching highly impacted communities and vulnerable populations. So really holding PSE accountable to those indicators and to those principles.
Great. And I'll just flag for all the speakers, there's a question for everyone about cost versus justice, motivations, and benefits. So any speakers feel free to chime in on that. And I'm going to focus on 2 more questions we have specifically for PSE. And the next one is, can you speak more about strategies that PSE has implemented to make energy planning relevant and approachable?
I think one of the things we're trying to do is always tying it back to what's in it for me. And that varies by different audiences. So whether it's, climate change is your motivator, or saving money is your motivator, trying to make sure we're addressing those. I will say part of our work in 2022 and during the implementation period is to work on clean energy education. It's something that we've heard from our equity advisor group is really important. And so I think we'll be learning more about how to share those messages and how to share kind of what it is we're doing with our planning process, how it looks, and when it's implemented. So it's a learning process.
Isn't everything? Thank you so much. And one more question I'll throw out to you. This person was intrigued by the lesson learned on making communication about clean energy accessible and relevant. And this is true for Clean Energy Transformation Act planning, but also a chronic issue with program materials and how we generally share information with non-EE folks. I think this is related to what you were just saying. What adjustments did you make, and how do you think this might change things in the future?
I think we're still making adjustments. I think for our team, like I said, going back to saying, well, kind of what's in it for me? What are customers going to notice that's different? So we've emphasized for our work, we're going to have more renewable energy. They're going to start to see more rooftop and ground solar and battery programs and demand response programs being offered. I think another context we've heard a lot from our equity advisory group is the visual nature, making our materials more visual, of course, more relevant, but we're also focusing on moving into more trans-created materials where rather than the material just being translated, working with the community to where, again, the material's relevant to customers within that community.
Thank you so much. And those are all the questions we have right now, just for Diane. Of course, folks, feel free to put them in the chat. But again, there was a question for all speakers. So I'm just going to take a minute to see if any speakers want to add to what's been going on in the chat. And this question was asking about biggest cost motivations for equity in the energy transition. And if any speakers could add anything about the economic benefits and cost competitiveness that energy equity and justice might offer to utilities. And Ariel put some information in the chat about societal non-energy benefits of clean energy programs and efforts that already exist to monetize those, and some thoughts on that. But if any speakers want to add to it, feel free to do so.
Great, and then I'm happy to chime in a little bit. It's a really good question, and I think the question is out there certainly of does this feel good, and is this window dressing, or are we actually moving the needle, and is there justification to orient programs and whatnot in this way towards equity and incorporating equity and then measuring the impacts that we're having? A few things that I could potentially offer. So as we address energy burden and affordability specifically in our low-income programs, one of the things we specifically recognize is that when household energy costs are lower, what does that enable households to then pay for and not divert, let's say, money away from groceries or medical bills, or fall into arrears on their utility bills. And all of these pieces, specifically around arrearage management, are certainly very deeply enmeshed and connected to the energy efficiency utility space. And so kind of the trickle out impacts are really substantial. If the driving kind of force or directive for how to implement an energy efficiency program is around equity, specifically, let's say, energy burden reduction or affordability or increasing access. And one of the other things that we're focusing a lot on in Vermont is certainly addressing kind of peak demand, specifically as there are more high heat days every year across the United States, certainly, and Vermont is by no means, exempt from that. And so as low-income households are using inefficient, let's say, air conditioners, switching to cold climate heat pumps is a really, really effective way to address grid issues overall and having to resort to dirty energy and coal plants on those peak times. So that's another kind of snippet, kind of some of those other kind of cost-effective kind of trickle out impacts of addressing energy justice and equity.
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren. And I just want to say thank you one more time to Diane, but also to all of our speakers. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure I am not alone in that. And so we're going to go ahead into a 5-minute break now, and then we'll jump right into our interactive section where we focus on our paths forward. So we're going to get our timer going, and we will see you back in 5 minutes. Thanks, everybody.